Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this edition of State of the World. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Torrey. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and we are so happy to open up our season today with Andrew Adams. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Megan. It's a real pleasure to be here and appreciate the opportunity.
Today, we have a really special edition of State of the World for you. Andrew Adams is the director of the Department of Justice Kleptocapture Task Force, sort of in charge of seizing Russian assets and enforcing sanctions on Russia. And we are going to put the full link to Andrew's very impressive bio in the chat so everyone can follow up. I really want to just jump in and bring Andrew into the conversation. So Andrew, can you really start by telling us a little bit about the Kleptocapture Task Force, how it was conceived, the scope of work, and why and how it's unique?
Sure. So again, thank you for the opportunity. I'm really glad to be here, and the work that the council does is obviously extremely important. The opportunity to talk to this audience in particular is really useful, I think, for the department. The task force obviously came together in response to the most recent illegal Russian incursion into Ukraine. This was something that came together relatively quickly on the heels of that invasion. The Attorney General announced the creation of this task force within a matter of days after the initial troops moved into Ukraine. And the idea has been to demonstrate the breadth, the scope, the power of U.S. sanctions, economic sanctions, and U.S. export controls, all aimed at Russian aggression. The task force has pulled on resources across the DOJ, and the way it came together really was to corral a lot of experts from a lot of different components of the Department of Justice and focus it on this particular crisis at this particular moment. But it comes from a deep well of experience within the department. For years now, for about a decade, there has been a kleptocracy unit within Maine Justice out of Washington, and that's a group of people who have a singular focus on corruption, on the exploitation of assets of the people of various countries, and has a deep well of experience in Ukraine in particular. And focusing on Russian kleptocracy in particular. So the people in that group have been a key part of the effort here. But the nice thing about where the task force sits and how it's been put together is that it goes beyond the criminal division and the money laundering components of the Department of Justice. We're drawing on experts and attorneys, analysts, linguists from the National Security Division, from the tax division, from pockets of DOJ that may not immediately come to mind as a key component of a criminal response, but are a major part of putting the pieces together here. And at the same time, we work directly with our law enforcement partners across the U.S. government. So the FBI, Homeland Security, the Postal Service, the IRS, et cetera. Everybody has a piece of the action here. And the task force's role is really one of coordination of those efforts, identifying strategic priorities, and then executing on those strategic priorities through both civil forfeiture and seizures of key assets, and criminal prosecution of both oligarchs who may be kleptocrats themselves, or facilitators both of money laundering and furtherance of sanctions violation, or the evasion of export controls, which are a critical component of what we're working on.
Andrew, can you talk a little bit more about the sanctions in which you're trying to enforce? The evolution. When did they start? What are their goals?
Sure. So the parameters for this task force are Russian aggression. It is sort of the key point of focus. But that goes back well beyond 2022. We're talking about the original Crimean invasion in late 2014 as the initial starting point for what this task force is focused on, and the evasion of sanctions that have been put in place in response to these illegal incursions since that time. So there have been a series of sanctions from OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control within the Treasury Department, sanctions that have been spearheaded by the State Department in some cases, and then a broad series and an escalating series of export restrictions and essentially controls on what technology or intellectual property can be sent to Russia or for Russian use. Going that far back. And that, of course, has been significantly elevated since about February of this year. But those programs remain the focus of what the task force is looking at. The goals are twofold. On the economic sanctions front, the real goal here is to choke off the ability for the Russian war machine to fund itself, and for people who are either in a position of power, close to power, or are close to sort of the levers of finance within the Russian state and Russian polity, to close off their access to Western capital and financial flows. And on the other hand, looking at the export control regime, to very directly cut off the ability of, in particular, the Russian military to rearm itself, to arm itself in the first instance, and to make them less of a fighting force, which has, I think, paid some serious dividends, especially as we've seen recently.
Absolutely. So you're made director of this task force. Can you talk to us a little bit about, how do you even begin? Do you have to work with global partners? How do you actually carry out the work?
Sure. So to begin with, because the department has had a focus on sanctions enforcement and Russian sanctions in particular for a number of years, part of the effort here is corralling the cases that exist across the U.S. government, across the U.S. attorneys' offices around the country, and identifying those and foisting resources into those ongoing investigations. That's sort of the first order of business. At the same time, we're identifying new cases to bring, new strategic priorities to tackle. And thinking about that cohesively with Treasury, thinking about that with state, thinking about where can we bring cases or bring seizures that will have an outsized impact, either reverberate through the private sector and cause sort of a ripple effect of the freezing of assets or the cutting off of access to financial markets, or to identify key people that may be particularly useful to cut off from Western access. In terms of global partnerships, that's also has been and remains a major part of what the task force is working on and has to put resources into every single day. At the very outset of the invasion, there was a real disconnect, I would say, or there was a gulf between U.S. sanctions and what our authorities and our abilities were, and foreign partner sanctions. There were certain states, certain countries that had enacted Russian sanctions or enacted similar sorts of controls in response to the 2014 invasion, for example. But that was not remotely universal. And what you saw in the first few weeks and months of this war was a significant realignment, unprecedented, really, in terms of foreign partners across Europe, in the UK, and even well beyond that, coming into alignment with policies and restrictions that the US had in place for a number of years. That was an enormous boon for us in the DOJ. It makes our ability to investigate, our ability to collect information, to rely on foreign partners' ability to conduct arrests or seizures, significantly greater than what had existed in January of this year, for example.
So I want to bring in a question from the audience. And so it really is about how do you prioritize what assets you're seizing?
Sure. So some of it, one question is where are targets of opportunity? Are there assets that are in the United States, for example? And the answer is yes, and we're taking and have taken action on those. It's also the case that because the United States has been relatively unfriendly to Russian kleptocrats since 2014, at the very least, this is not a particularly good place to park your sanctions evading property. And many of the assets that we're looking at are going to be located abroad and have been located abroad, as we've seen with a number of the larger public seizures that we've had. So beyond thinking about what is in the United States where we can take quick action, we think about essentially who is on OFAC's list, who are the priority targets there. Think about people who are close to the levers of power, or close to levers of disinformation, and where we can take action that might influence those people or discomfort those people in ways that will have, like I say, an outsized effect. In the same way, and thinking about sort of thinking systemically within the Russian economy, and what parts of the Russian economy are important to rearmament, for example. We think about ways in which we can bring in action, be it an arrest, be it a seizure, be it an investigation that ropes in private sector partners. Where can we act in a way that will have those kinds of outsized effects on the Russian military's ability to rearm itself? And that may mean taking action in spaces that are sort of less well known and maybe less publicly understood as part of the sanctions regime. We think about where we can take action on, for example, in the secondary securities markets that are relatively obscure, but if you can bring those kinds of actions, you have an enormously outsized effect that may cause privately held firms around the world to think twice before engaging in business with particular people.
Andrew, and I know some of this is in the public domain, so can you talk a little bit about what assets you have seized? I know we've heard about this very dramatic example of seizing, I think, a super yacht in Spain. What are some of the other things that you have worked successfully to seize? Sure.
So you're right. I'll keep it to the publicly disclosed stuff for sure. And the big ticket items are some relatively ostentatious yachts. There have been a number of bank account seizures, security seizures as well, that I think are sort of less publicly touted. It's hard to hide the $500 million yacht once you've seized it. So I think everybody has seen that come across the ocean. Those are examples of proceeds of sanctions evasion, and examples of property that are involved in money laundering. And apart from simply taking away the toys from particularly corrupt actors, the benefit there is again the demonstration really of the U.S. breadth and scope of these sanctions and what the tools to hand may be. That sends a message to people in parts of the economy, in parts of the legitimate economy, that signal pressure points and weaknesses that need to be looked at more closely. So what we've tried to do with these actions is not simply seize the boat or seize the bank account, but to be as aggressively as possible consistent with DOJ obligations and policies, to lay out a roadmap of what are the shell companies, what are the opaque financial networks that were behind these ownerships and the financial transactions that allowed for them to evade sanctions in the first place. So that there's a document in the world that banks, that insurance companies, that maritime or aviation services companies can look at and understand and enact in their own compliance processes.
So I'm going to bring in another audience question here. When collaborating with foreign partners, you know, how do you address jurisdictional concerns? And does that affect who holds the assets?
It certainly can affect who holds the assets. So one point of taking some of these actions early on is to demonstrate the scope of U.S. jurisdiction in this space. In particular, U.S. dollar transactions that go to facilitating sanctions evasion under U.S. law very often will give a jurisdictional hook for bringing a criminal case, for bringing a civil forfeiture case. And then the question is simply one of international comity and treaty obligations in terms of whether our foreign partners will execute on a warrant, for example, that will obtain here. There are, however, certainly cases in which assets exist abroad, are funded through non-US dollar transactions, have essentially no territorial nexus or financial nexus to the United States. But that doesn't end the question for the task force. What we have also done is prioritize our partners' priorities. If there is an EU action that our friends in the European Union want to act on, if there's an asset that's sitting in France or Germany or Italy or Spain, and we have information that we can share, that we can provide to facilitate their action, that has also been something that we've been aggressively pursuing and trying to make as many waves in as many ways as possible without being selfish about the right of first action on that.
So once you seize an asset, what happens to it? Whether it's the big super yacht, where do you put that big super yacht, or the bank accounts? Where do those funds sit? What happens to those assets once they're seized?
So at a high level, they're managed by the U.S. Marshal Service in most cases. With respect to financial instruments, if it's a bank account, they may be put into a suspense account, essentially an escrow account that holds seized assets pending a final order of forfeiture achieved through the courts. But in the interim, it sits in a holding account. Larger assets, physical assets, are exponentially more complicated. So a yacht, for example, of particular size can't fit in just any harbor. You need to find the right place. Assuming that you can even move it to begin with, you need to make sure that it is maintained. And importantly, both for maximizing potential resale value down the line, and also for protecting due process rights for potential claimants, we undertake to maintain the integrity of these assets. So whether it's a car or a boat or an artwork, et cetera, we take seriously the obligation to maintain those in good shape throughout. And that can involve hiring very specialized vendors. It can involve all manner of action by the Marshal Service and partners across the country.
So let's talk about the impact of these sanctions. So we know that there's been actually, can I back up, Andrew? Are you able to sort of quantify the amount of assets that you've seized? Is that something that is in the public realm?
I mean, what's in the public realm is quantifiable. What's beyond that, I obviously can't put a number to. But when we're talking about the yachts, for example, the price tags on those are relatively astronomical. Hundreds of millions of dollars. The bank accounts are whatever's in the bank accounts. It's many millions of dollars at this point.
Oh, excellent. So are you seeing that that's a sanction enforcement, that the seizing of Russian assets are they having any impact in the change, change in behavior? You talked earlier about those that are close to the circles of power. So in essence, perhaps Vladimir Putin and those around him, his family, and in his inner circle. Are we seeing any change in behavior, do you believe, because of these sanctions?
So I think there are a couple of ways to define those sorts of changes and in effect define success here. One is that kind of impact in a relatively direct fashion. What you have seen for sure has been an uptick in people within the economic elite of Russia publicly speaking out against the war. In some instances, publicly offering to pay exorbitant sums to Ukraine for rebuilding. All of that's nice. All of that's good. What the downstream effect of that may be is certainly likely to be more abstract. That said, what you have seen in the last several weeks is increasingly public dissatisfaction and vocal public dissatisfaction within Russia. That's a new phenomenon. And I think having top cover from economic elites and potentially political elites to continue to speak out is all to the good at the end of the day. More, another sort of direct impact that I think it bears emphasizing here goes to the export controls. And a lot of the conversation, a lot of the sort of public-facing efforts of the task force have been on these big, ostentatious oligarch assets. A quieter piece of this, but a critical piece of this, is the export controls and choking off of the ability of the Russian state to arm itself, to essentially feed itself through access to military technology and high technology that might be diverted to military ends. And what we see there, I think, is clearly impactful. The notion that Russia is purchasing drone technology from Iran or purchasing, frankly, anything from North Korea, I think, is a good sign that this export controls, not just the U.S. but globally, are having a serious impact. And then I'd say the final way I think about impact and success here goes back to our private sector partnerships. And again, instilling essentially a further and more robust culture of compliance across all manner of sectors. This has been an opportunity in many senses to engage with parts of the private sector that heretofore have not been as engaged on this problem set, on these problems, period. But to have conversations with people across industries outside of kind of the traditional banking industry about what it means to have a robust compliance function is furthered by being able to take these big public actions, being able to put in the public domain affidavits that walk through exactly how to think about shell company structures, for example. And in that sense, I think you're just going to see a long tail of further empowerment of compliance personnel in industries that go well beyond the traditional banking industry.
So let's talk a little bit about how these sanctions, a little bit more about how these sanctions are impacting business, right? So in order to comply, what are some of the changes that we're seeing? I know here in Connecticut, where we sit in a very defense-heavy state, in a very export-heavy state, how are we seeing sort of the Russian sanctions and impacting supply chains, impacting business practices? Are there any specific examples that you can point to that are sort of shifts in business?
Yeah, I mean, oil and coal exports, I think, are sort of at the top of the list of obvious shifts in business practices and people rethinking about where their supply comes from. But also, I think people in the shipping industry, for example, thinking hard about asking questions of people who may be attempting to avoid or evade export controls, asking questions about the bona fides of certificates of origin that don't quite make sense given a history of business practices or shipping from Russia by a particular counterparty, for example. And the notion that companies that are in this space, in that kind of import-export space, are devoting more time to thinking about that, are consulting with attorneys who are engaged in this space. The uptick of that, I think, is tangible. Beyond that, I think having conversations with people in more novel financial industries has certainly, in my experience, jumped up significantly. Thinking about fintech and crypto industries and their engagement on this problem set has been remarkable.
That's really interesting as we sort of look at fintech ecosystems and how that impacts the globe, right? So that's something that we think a lot about here in Connecticut. I'm going to go to a question from Mary Hendrickson, who is asking about how these sanctions are impacting the sort of everyday Russian citizen. I know we talked a little bit about the change that we've been seeing over the last few weeks, and in particular this week, especially within the media in higher levels within Russia. But do you think that these sanctions are having an impact on the sort of average Russian citizen?
From all accounts, it seems like the Kremlin's gone out of its way to mitigate as much as possible the impact on sort of everyday experience. That said, the loss of purchasing opportunities, I think, is clear. I think essentially the price of being an average Russian has been maintained under control through essentially extreme intervention by the Russian central bank and by the Kremlin in a way that is unlikely to be sustainable over the long term. What you definitely have seen, and what the Treasury Department and others have talked about, is bending the curve on the Russian economy and Russian growth dramatically downward. So you may not see bread lines in Moscow or anything today, but there's certainly an impact in terms of where opportunities will lie going forward, and the ability to interact with the West is crucially important to people in Russia. It's causing, I think, serious concern among Russian businesses, and it's causing people to speak out against the war and against the Kremlin policies, precisely because these impacts, though not instantly crippling of the entire Russian economy, are plainly setting them up for a future that is far worse than what they could have otherwise expected.
Thank you, Andrew. So a question from Pat in the audience. She wants to know, are Russian cryptocurrency assets escaping sanctions? Is that an area that you can target? How is your task force, how is the Kleptocapture task force dealing with cryptocurrencies?
So it's a great question. And it happens to be the case that at roughly the same time, a few months in advance, actually, the DOJ also set up what's called the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team. So this has not only been a focus of this task force, but DOJ in particular is engaged on cryptocurrency in the sanctions evasion space in a profound way over the last year in particular. Yes, Russian crypto assets exist, and they're a point of focus for us. We're certainly concerned that cryptocurrency, that virtual currency assets may be a way of evading sanctions, in particular in terms of payments and payment structures. This, again, sort of goes back to export controls. What we don't really expect is to see billions of dollars moving through cryptocurrency on behalf of a particular oligarch. There are structural economic reasons that it doesn't make a lot of financial sense that you would park billions of your dollars or billions of your rubles into crypto and attempt to move it across borders. It provides, I think, some seriously attractive money laundering opportunities for smaller scale payment. And for that reason, we are definitely looking at looking at it as an asset class, and even more specifically, looking at exchanges, looking at relatively centralized cryptocurrency hubs that might be a point of exploitation.
Excellent. So I have a question from David, who wants to know, what kind of tools does Russia have to respond or counteract sanctions? Are you seeing any actions from Russia that you can talk about?
Well, they've banned travel for a seemingly random set of individuals, including people who are deceased. So that's one response. I mean, clearly the Kremlin's focus here is on wreaking havoc and carnage and brutality in Ukraine and exploiting the Ukrainian people. Is it possible that there may be retaliatory sanctions from Russia? Yes. Is the Russian economy and the ability to transact in Russia so fundamentally or existentially important that I think we're worried about that? No.
Okay, great. I do have another question from Abby, who I think took it from someone in the chat and put it in Q&A. So can the assets that you're seizing be redirected to support efforts in Ukraine? Are there any, what are the limits on what you can do?
So that's a fantastic question. Focusing on US assets for a second, or rather focusing on the United States' ability to forfeit an asset. There are constraints that exist and will direct how assets can be used. So there's legislation that is under consideration, under conversation right now, that would very clearly provide for the ability to put money essentially into a Ukraine rebuilding fund. And that's something that I think would be to the good. There is, the Attorney General does have a good deal of discretion with respect to many of these assets, but certainly under certain statutes and regulations, assets are directed to specifically defined categories of victims. And there's no question or debate that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people are victims of an unspeakable crime. Marrying that with the current state of forfeiture statutes, there is a disconnect to a certain degree. Our goal here is to do exactly that. And assets may sit in sort of a seized asset account pending the ability to do that in a streamlined, smart way.
Thank you, Andrew. So I do have a question from Jack, and I think you touched on it a little bit, but just to revisit to answer. Jack says there appears to be significant extraterritorial aspects to what the Kleptocapture task force is doing. What have been the reactions of our allies and our partners, such as the EU, where Jack believes traditionally these countries have opposed extraterritorial measures by the United States, but is it different in this case?
Yeah, it is a good question. The kinds of measures that have taken place have been in partnership across the board. So if we're talking about the seizure of a yacht, for example, in Mallorca, Spain, that's impossible without the Spanish government being a key part of it. Similarly, the authorities in Fiji were phenomenally helpful. I mean, to a degree that deserves enormous applause. Fiji, which is a much smaller country than the United States or our European allies, put an enormous amount of effort and intellectual heft into their action on the Amadea. And yes, that's extraterritorial, but it's certainly not without buy-in from the local partner. What we have are laws in the United States that do allow for seizure of assets that may be located outside of the United States. But what we do to obtain those assets is to obtain a warrant here in the United States on probable cause, presented to a US judge. And then as a typical matter, we transmit that through the treaty process. We give that to our partners through mutual legal assistance treaties or through other sorts of diplomatic channels, and execute on it in conjunction with or in cooperation with those foreign partners. There have not been examples of extraterritorial action in the sense of the US swooping in and snatching a yacht without telling anybody in advance.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but on that yacht that was seized in Fiji, there was some talk about you finding an artifact, perhaps a Fabergé egg. Is there any update on that?
There's certainly no public update I can give on any of that. The number of fun assets that exist across this space, I think, will be endless. I'm hopeful that we can get to some public disclosures down the line that will titillate everybody.
So we will definitely have to have you back at a later date to sort of give us the update, because I know that this is just so fascinating. I do have another business question, and I think it's very pertinent because I'm sitting here in Hartford, in the insurance capital of the world. But can you talk a little bit about your goal to dissuade insurance companies from doing business with oligarchs in particular?
Absolutely. So the insurance industry is critically important to much of what we're looking at. And look, these are massive financial institutions in many cases. They have deep wells of compliance experience. This is a sector of the American economy where there has been a culture of compliance instilled for decades now. The benefit of having that as essentially a partner in this action is that we can take outsized effect beyond even our ability to put hands on a particular asset. If there's a document that demonstrates to insurance companies, for example, that a particular shell company structure is tainted, it leads back to a sanctioned individual, and that providing the services to that sanctioned individual would be against US law, you can have insurance companies that will essentially fire the client or pull coverage from these significant assets. From my perspective, in terms of defining what counts as a win, if I seize a plane and bring it to the United States and park it here for the duration of litigation, fantastic. That is one way to define success. But if no one can move the plane because no one can get insurance on the plane, and so no one will pilot the plane or crew the plane, that can count as a success as well in my book.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to ask a few more questions, but I know we're just about to run out of time. But if you permit me, I'm gonna continue with a few more. A question from Mary, who wants to know about, do you think sort of Russia and Putin's policies in regards to energy and its energy supply to Europe are going to have any impact or are having any impact on the West's ongoing sanctions?
So in terms of what the impacts may be, assuming different scenarios with respect to Nord Stream, et cetera, is a little certainly beyond my remit, my wheelhouse. There are economists that are the experts in all of that. What we have seen, I think, notwithstanding the decisions to choke off Nord Stream and to threaten essentially Europe with a shortage of Russian oil, is a steadfast perseverance by the EU and by its member states dedicated to maintaining sanctions that are in place today in response to Russian aggression. That hasn't changed. The messaging on that hasn't changed, and I don't expect that the reality will change either.
So I'm going to combine two questions, one from Amanda and one from someone who is remaining anonymous. But it's about the fact that kleptocracy is not a unique problem or unique challenge. only to Russia, that there are other countries in the world that form tax havens, that have different ways of exploiting natural resources, human resources. Are there any other countries or groups in which you think that your task force can serve as a model for in the future? Or, what do you think?
So this task force is obviously focused on Russian aggression in particular. We are engaged with countries that I think often fall into the bucket of, at least in public perception, tax havens or relatively opaque sorts of financial jurisdictions. What I'd say is, in many cases, those jurisdictions are cooperative in ways that people might not expect. And certainly the Russian oligarch crew might not expect. And that has been a consequence, I think, of the global reaction against this war. Going forward, my focus is going to be on this situation, this crisis. I do think that there have been some real successes from this task force. I think that there are structurally some important lessons to be learned in the event of future crises. But in terms of pivoting off of this problem set, I won't be doing that, certainly in this gig.
Well, you truly have a fascinating job, and we are so grateful for you spending time with us today and really talking about the importance of what you're doing, because it has true global impact at a very critical time for so many. But before we go, I want to ask you if you can talk to us a little bit about what your best case scenario is. What's your best case outcome, your ultimate goal? When you come to work every day, when we all sort of sit down at the computer and what drives you, what do you ultimately hope to achieve?
So it's a fantastic question, and again, thank you for the opportunity to talk so in depth and with such a engaged audience. Look, at the broad level, I don't think we expect that Putin is going to stop the war tomorrow or anytime soon necessarily. That's an unfortunate reality, but that can't be how we define success. At the broadest level, I think what we want to do is to continue to demonstrate that countries that are dedicated to the rule of law, that are dedicated to due process and international norms, are not without power in the face of illegal aggression. So the ways we do that may be at quite a retail level. If that means that we come in and we seize an asset, or we effect an arrest, or we announce a new shell company structure so that we can shake foundations within the private sector, that counts as success every day. That's why we get out of bed every day.
Andrew, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And thank you to our live audience. You'll be able to see this on our YouTube channel for the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and anywhere where you get your podcasts, and subscribe to State of the World. Andrew, thank you so much. And we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, Megan. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.